I thought first I should just tell you a few small sentences about Mr. Stoler himself, our guy here. He was a child of immigrant parents, and his father was a kind of a troublemaker. He had to leave Russia quickly, and in fact, in a late life recorded interview, he said, "A policeman was killed, and I wasn't innocent." So he left fast. They got him across Germany. They got him into France. He spent some time in England, and he ended up here in 1910. And Ezra was born in 1915. He was actually born in Chicago because the father at that point was involved in it was a trade unionist, and he was blacklisted in New York. He couldn't get a job, so he went to Chicago for a couple of years, and that was when Ezra was born. So he's but really a New Yorker. He came back right away and lived here. He ended up with a kind of a spotty high school record, but he went to NYU to study architecture. NYU doesn't have an architecture school any longer. It closed the year he was finished. He was quite proud of himself. He always said, that he broke it. And nonetheless, he made some important connections there that got him started in the right direction. Ed Stone was one of his teachers, and in the course of meeting fellow students, and some of them worked for architects at that point, he ended up taking some photographs for a firm that needed work, that then was submitted to a competition, then was published. So while he was even sort of figuring out where his career would go, he had published work. He got to know the architecture editors, and so it sort of moved along. There was a war in there that sort of interrupted the trajectory, as you can imagine. But he met Howard Myers, who was the editor of the Architectural Forum, who was very important to him. And many of the early assignments when he went to the whole sort of Gropius connection was on assignment for the Architectural Forum. And when he first went to Frank Lloyd Wright's place, both in Wisconsin and in Arizona, that was also commissioned by the Architectural Forum. He also, at some point at that time, met a man named Will Burton, who was a graphic designer. They worked together when Will was the art director at Fortune magazine. Will Burton is known as the man who brought Helvetica to America. And there's a sort of a dreadful story about Will being asked to do the graphics for the Third Reich, and he refused. The second time he was asked, he knew he really couldn't refuse, so he said he would take this job when he took first a little vacation. So he packed a little bag with his wife, who happened to be Jewish, and they came to New York. So, and they were very close friends. My father and Will were very close friends, and in the course of selecting work for the book, a lot of that was work that they had collaborated on. And at the same time, in the 40s, he also got working with a man named Richard Pratt, who, this even sounds funny, the architecture editor of the Ladies' Home Journal. I mean, it doesn't even seem that those things go together. Pratt was very interested in early American homes, and so while he was photographing modern architecture for architects and for magazines, he was photographing these funny little sort of house museums, where the people live upstairs and open the doors on Thursday afternoons for a quarter or 2 quarters or something. So there was a collection of this historical material, and it's always interesting to see how they sort of cross-pollinated, what affected what. I know at one point, when we sat down to do the book, we were very interested in the well, of course, Nina Rappaport's always interested in factories and the architecture that grows out of it. This is really form that comes, absolutely form follows function. And so that became one of the sections in the book that we sort of pursued. And I think there was a point when Ezra was actually thinking of giving up architecture altogether and concentrating more on factories and shipbuilding and I can't even think what all there are, hydroelectric plants. I mean, you see these quite amazing structures that are, the work was sort of not known so well. He really worked on commission for most of his life. Only sort of at the end did he begin, with some encouragement, to make prints and sell individual prints. But he was always much more interested in the whole story. And he was also very interested in the sequence of how you presented the work. He he used to make prints and then bind them together so that you really had to look at it the way he wanted you to. And when you gave people slides, of course, they'd throw them all around and rearrange them and get them all out of order. One asks what he might have done with digital possibilities, and I can't even begin to imagine, because I think he would be completely out of control. I think he would, it's hard enough to say, leave this the way it is, even though you can change it. I mean, and what's real, and how far do you go before it doesn't count anymore, So, as Carol said, during the 50s and the 60s, he was really kind of the court photographer for Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and worked both for the office in New York and for the office in Chicago, and for the colleagues in San Francisco as well. And as you'll see in this presentation, it sort of looks like those are either the years that he was alive or the years that he lived in New York, which neither of which is true. It looked okay when we put it together, that's sort of what happens. But before we start on this, looking at the images, I thought I would tell you a little bit how the book happened. At one point, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we were asked to if we would put together an exhibition for a commercial building in Washington. And these weren't the art prints and the edition prints that we've been working on now. This was really just a lobby. And the developer was interested in sort of upgrading the building to be sort of an architecture place. And whatever he spent to make these prints in the lobby paid off very well for him, because Knoll rented the second floor for their Washington showroom. So, we didn't quite know what we were getting into, but it was fine. And I asked Nina Rappaport if she would curate this show, partly because I just knew I'd look at the same 15 images and it would look like a school project again, So she really dug in with a whole different point of view. And Nina has a connection at Yale. She works in the architecture school with all the publications and the, is it quarterly? I think quarterly, or occasionally the newspapers that they put out. And so then she said, well, we've done this show, and I'm looking at all the factory work and the commercial technical aspect. What about a book? And we began to do it. It really wasn't so hard. Some people just are almost surprised that the content was there. And for us, it was more difficult to edit 60,000 photographs than to find enough pictures to fill a book. So we decided then to break it into 3 sections. There are 3 essays. Aki Bush wrote about the residential work, but he did a lot of photography for House Beautiful and House and Garden. And some of it was definitely architecture, and some of it was not so much architecture. But of course, it's all part of the same person working, and it's very hard to draw these lines between which part of you counts and which part of you doesn't make as much of a difference. And then John Dixon wrote about what he called capital A architecture. And Nina wrote an essay about the factory work and about the sort of trajectory in that area. We decided that each section would follow chronologically. And so it was fairly clear. There were these 3 areas, and each one sort of started in 40-something and went as far as it went. We tried very hard to give a sort of a full view, indicating where he was when and how he was working on things. But still, you can only have so many pictures in a book. So it did involve a lot of editing and a lot of things left out. This selection came out in a sort of a funny way when I worked on a quick little talk in the summer, and Carol said, would you perhaps expand that? And I thought, well, let's take this in a somewhat different way. Instead of following it either by theme, strictly by thematic, or strictly chronologic, let's just take a piece of New York and look around from a slightly different way. I thought we would follow from Grand Central Station up Park Avenue, and not really to follow a timeline, but more or less move up from 42nd Street and up and up and up. And then at the end of the selection of images, we actually moved down to this neighborhood, to the Chase Manhattan Bank building, which was interesting because he photographed the model this is where I have to look at my notes. He photographed the model in 55, and I think by the time the building was finished, I think in 1960, he was sort of somewhat out of favor, either with the designers or with the, I don't know exactly what. So he never photographed the finished building. But in 1981, when David Rockefeller was retiring from president of the bank, I mean, what do you give? You can't give him a gold watch, so what do they give him? So they decided to have a group of photographs commissioned. And so those were done for a slightly different reason, not for the architect, but to sort of show the bank in the city. And the funny thing is, I just read a couple of weeks ago that the building has been sold to the Chinese. So you think, okay, that's the next chapter. In choosing this, I sort of went roughly north on Park Avenue. At the same time, there's a little bit of a mix-up, so you have to sort of keep jumping around a little bit, because in one place you follow a model, and then it turns into a building, or then you see a hole in the ground, and that turns into a building. It's a little bit, if one way would be vertical and one would be horizontal, this is kind of diagonal, and I hope it's not too confusing. So let's just see. We start with some images that David, well, this is the very first one, is Grand Central. You know, they're making a great celebration because it's the centennial, and the building opened in 1913. The fact is, there was a previous building on that site, and everything was quite different about it, because I was recently reading this whole business. I feel like I'm a little out of my league to talk so much about. The original station was on 26th Street, and that site became the original Madison Square Garden. It was on Madison Square, you know. So this was moved in the 1870s, and then this building was put up in about 1913. So you begin to see what's going on around it, and that Park Avenue goes back there. Now, Park Avenue at this point was already a park, and there already were tracks buried. But when the building, in the 1870s, the tracks were above ground or on grade, and it turns out that there was a great outcry, and Vanderbilt agreed to bury the tracks. He got the city to pay half of it, and then, knowing what was coming, he bought a lot of land along the sides, because it would be so nice when the tracks weren't there. So this then is the station as we know it, and as we just saw it, with the MetLife building, which of course Breuer thought was his magnum opus and the greatest thing he ever would do. I'm not sure the year this was photographed, 3 or 4 years ago, I think. And these are David Sundberg's pictures. So here you see, of course, that building again. And what I was trying to do with these, it's easy to see where the Chrysler building is, the edges. And that's, in a way, what the photographer is doing, is always to sort of place the image in its surroundings in a way that you can both get the information and also become somewhat comfortable. You know, those posters those fire posters that say "You are here," and you always are fine until you try to figure out where you are. Well, I guess that's always the responsibility as well. So here in the bottom part, you can see the Grand Central Station, and you're always sort of given a point of reference, MetLife building, but also by the Chrysler building. And even wider photograph, you still see the station, and you see the cars coming around it, but you also see the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building. So this is really tells you exactly where you are. Now, we just talked a little bit about Vanderbilt and Park Avenue. This is Vanderbilt Avenue, and it's the Yale Club on the left, looking at the Union Carbide Building, which is now called J.P. Morgan Chase. This was photographed in 1960. And I guess I should spend a minute telling you that the way the archive was always organized the year was kind of the key, and then the chronological numbers meant to do with the jobs as they came in. But you'll see here that something else funny happened. The building's the same, but some of the things around it changed, and we had no record of when that happened. So there's a photograph that he was trying to show. Here it's a little peculiar because you see it keeps on going. You can't figure out where it stops. I believe that you can see Lever House in the back there, and you can see that Park Avenue, for all the parkness of it, really this is the ventilation for the train tunnels, of course, that you don't sort of notice when you're on the street. And in the course of looking at these images, I just kept seeing, oh, well, there he was standing somewhere. He was on a building, he was on a rooftop of a building opposite this one. And it's sort of difficult to see exactly which one it is, but we'll keep watching as this happens. Now this, of course, was after the Seagram building, but still has a plaza that's exactly on grade. It's kind of an interesting approach to things, and you're looking back at the building that's at Grand Central. Now here, you know, this building, he's probably on the building that we saw last time, and you can imagine that he's really trying to get the whole thing in, but there's just something in the way there. I mean, and it's still, you can begin to figure that he had to figure out where to be at what time of day, and did he stay there long enough for the sun to come around? I can only imagine that he had some idea when he wanted to do this, and he wanted enough shadow on the one side so that there was a differentiation. I mean, you line of photographers know all this, but it doesn't just happen, you know. Somebody has to make those decisions. Now, the thing that I went into the job folder, I mean, I particularly like that little triangle of sun that comes out, and this whole front is in light, but you can see what was happening there. The shadow was just either coming up or going down. It's just at that moment that he got almost everything of the building in sun. Now watch this building on the right, because I was looking in the same job folder and was quite surprised, because in the next minute this changes, and I didn't even realize that. Something's wrong here. The other thing is, of course, that the building across the street isn't there anymore. So it's so interesting. And I was thinking also about all the building that happened along Park Avenue after the Civil War. Here we are, after another war, suddenly building like crazy. I mean, this is just what happens. Now that building's, there it is. You see, it's more finished. And again, he's found a vantage point. It's a little bit lower. That's always a very interesting thing, too. I mean, do you want to be as high up as possible looking down on something? Or do you want to have a sort of a view across so that you feel more engaged and not just sort of separate, as a bird's eye view would be? Now we're moving uptown to something completely different. And it's interesting. This is now all the way up to Lever House. The slab was the same. The lower section was the same. In lighting the model, I became sort of interested in whether he would arrange the lighting on the model the way the sun would really be. I mean, there's no reason that a photographer would have to do that, but I think that for the most part he did. And I had a very strange moment. When I was first looking at that, it looked to me like that lower part was rounded. I thought, wouldn't that have been a strange touch? What would have that done to the rest of Park Avenue and everybody who followed along, you know, all the Me Too's. You see on some of these models too, what happens is the massing is such that the buildings around them are in to indicate what it would look like. But in photography, they can lift them right out. Now, of course, this is the real building again. And so you can see some of the differences in how it was handled. One of the sad things about this now is that building that's just west of there is so terrible. I don't even know what it is. It's a Banco Santander, I think. It's a dreadful sort of postmodern decorated thing, and it's rather a shame. It came years later, but I mean, it's where that slab with the two windows is now, in the picture now. So here's another model. It's a little bit too much going on at the bottom of this image, but it's interesting to see that it's an image that he made from the model, and then, of course, from the building itself. And always trying to be sure that the light is coming into that pit. You could photograph and have no idea that there's anything going on there, that this is open from the bottom, and that it's, in fact, not a roof all the way across. So the photographer has to understand that aspect of it and be sure to tell that story, or else it's too easy to be completely mixed up. Now this is the model again. From where I am, it looks crazy foreshortened. I think it's not quite that way, in fact. And back to the building. And you know, this was all built with great hopefulness. These materials really hadn't been proven, and it turned out that it was a tremendous effort to try to replicate it and both preserve it and replicate it when one thinks about what's been going on at the UN now, which is going back to bare bones. And at the end, I'll tell you a funny UN story, which I maybe post this. So what you begin to see here is that in the foreground, toward us, there's something missing now, a building that was there, and if you can imagine what's there, you know what's coming. It's just the building. And of course the Racket Club is still there as stately as ever, and everything else around it has changed a great deal. So backing up further, you can see what's going on there. I think you can get a sense of some of this if you go into the parking garage. I haven't driven into that parking garage in a long time, but I think you'll see what goes on when you see all the structure. Remember when those construction fences used to be made of all the doors that were taken out of the buildings? They don't seem to have those anymore. This begins to be, how many times was he there? I can't tell you. I mean, was that one time when they were digging the hole, and now this was another day? I'm not sure. This begins to get you into the kind of gutsy industrial making things images. It's not finished, and it's not really telling the story, but it's fabulous pictures. And you know, some of these you get a sense that it could be anything in here. I mean, it could be a foundry, it could be I don't know what it could mean. This, of course, looks like those other big circles that we know so well, you know, from Exeter. It's just, is it all structural? I mean, do pipes go through this? I don't know. Carol, you know, we're kind of the opening act for Phyllis Lambert's talk next month about the Seagram building. And I don't know that she has these pictures in her book, and she must have known they exist, but it wasn't. I don't think they're in the book. So you've seen these. And of course, this is a view of the Seagram building that you could never ever see again. I mean, there's a building in the way now, and we all sort of remember the building from these photographs, but in fact, you didn't see it this way, really. And there's, again, that construction site. You can see the Racket Club roofs, and you can see the whole plaza and the pools. And also that the rest of the city is really all the way to the river, is very much the old city. You've got the, you know, this side it's a little bit more built up, sort of downtown, midtown, and then further south. And you see the UN in the background there. This is the question about color in black and white that's always sort of interesting. Does it show you anything you didn't know before? I guess it shows you the brilliancy of the building, but the black and white is so much more, to me, seems so much more engaging. It's asking so much more of you, and not giving you this sort of make-believe colors, which there's always something missing. Now this, I think, is Leverhouse on this side, so he was in the next block, and it's always sort of interesting to see how far back you can go, and how much easier it was to wander around and photograph in the city. You know, now you try to gain access to something, it's a big production. It used to be, it was just a small bribery. Now you need insurance certificates, and when you tell them you have this many millions, they want more. I mean, what can a photographer do? But anyway, that's just life. So now you're seeing the construction site across from Lever and next to the Seagram building. In fact, it's an interesting photograph because you see a lot going on without really being quite sure what you're looking at, you know. And I used to think this was somehow the greenery in the middle of the street, till I realized, no, this has to be the edge of Lever, right? It's just the garden at the edge. And these photographs were made in 1958. And then at a certain point, he went back again in 91. This was one of the last things he did. I think you were with him, Jeff, weren't you? On these. And so it's a whole different sense. I mean, even he had to look up to see what was going on, and when he's always sort of the king of straight lines here, but it's... I remember when the model for the Citicorp building came to his studio, the thing that was the funniest of all was that the top wasn't attached and you could photograph it in different ways. I mean, it, I guess, has to go south, face south for all kinds of reasons, but the fact is it could have gone the other way. And it's a wonderful photograph because it's sort of nervy to just... Traditional way is to have the sun behind you, and then you don't have any issues with it. Really gives you more of a sense of what it's like to be in on that plaza, and also to see right across the street and see the building that's diagonally in the corner. When I don't know if you books that Princeton Architectural Press did about 10 years ago. There were 10 in the series. And when Mark Lamster was the editor, called and asked if we'd be interested in doing a book on a building, it was exactly what Ezra had always wanted to do. I mean, it was perfect. And what I thought was so interesting about how Mark put it all together, the images were all numbered sort of sequentially, starting with one from a distance and coming closer and closer. Mark put them in exactly the order. He wasn't given them that way, and he sort of organized it in the way that Ezra would have done, which is really great.
What church is that on the corner?
Which corner? Over there?
Yeah.
I don't know what church that is.
No, it's not St. Bart's.
St. Bart's is down, there's 2 blocks down. That must be on,
Everything is there.
oh, it's not there? So in putting the book together, Mark did several spreads of just these people. He kept using the same ones, which I thought was terrific. Usually, you know, a printed page has its value and you won't use the space unless you can be sure. Okay, so we can go through these people.
Church, is that where City Corporate?
Yes.
And that new, and that.
Oh, so it was St. Peter's. St. Peter's that was incorporated in. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
St. Peter's. Oh, it's like the old St. Peter's.
One of the old
Oh, that would make sense.
So it's like, it's certainly like this.
So this is another sort of piece of New York that we're thinking a lot about lately because of Roosevelt Island and the Four Freedoms Park, which is just out there. And you now, of course, can't see it from this location at all, I'm sure. Yeah. The other thing you realize when you look closely at these photographs, not necessarily the ones I'm showing, you see the pictures of Guggenheim when Fifth Avenue was a two-way street. It seems like one-way street is just natural. I mean, why would it not be like that? Now, this is another vantage point, and I can't even imagine that was how you could fall off, it seems to me, or there's yeah. So this is another one of these late views. This is St. Bart's here on the right, on Park Avenue. And we didn't ever see it from this angle, but it's very interesting just to see the changes and the fabric and the sort of depth of it all, and of course realizing that so much is changing now with so many more and tall buildings coming that will change the whole dynamic, you know. Now this is moving a little bit further uptown. This is the Pepsi-Cola building on 59th Street. And I just think it's interesting to see this because, look, they put clouds over there as if there would be clouds going down to the ground. And you can see the edge of the everything. Yeah, he's sort of hopeful, you know. And this model was clearly not one of these tight urban things full of other buildings. This was photographed in 1957, and then the building itself was finished in 60. So this is pretty speedy from one thing to the next. It's interesting to see how the model, the whole curtain wall was considered and then was photographed even with the model itself. And these are all hand cut. This is not laser cut models. This is all you know, you can begin to see the glue if you look too closely. It's a whole different approach. And here's the building. And it's just you know, interested in, you see this? Did you need, it certainly gives you a different point of view, this fancy code. You know, he would probably expose 2 or 3 black and white negatives and then 2 or 3 or 4 color transparency. So there always were choices. I mean, some things were moving, the traffic was moving, there were different exposures. And I mean, it's even hard now to realize how complicated it all was. In the very end, there's a picture of him with not his camera case, but with his case that had the film holders in it. And when you think about, you know, shooting 8x10 sheet film, every exposure was a real commitment. And I realized recently that when I go into a hotel room and there's no black tape around the bathroom door, there's something funny there, because that was clearly the dark room. I mean, it's just how it was. So here we are looking back down Park Avenue. It sort of seems like this time of year, everybody's kind of bundled up and the light is low. And I suppose if you could figure out exactly the shadows, you'd know exactly what day and what time of year it was. And the building that you see is the one that's now north of Grand Central Station. And it's before there was the Pan Am building there, or MetLife, whatever it's called these days. So now we're going to go downtown, come more to this neighborhood. And the project is the Chase Manhattan Bank. These photographs were made in 1981, whereas the model, and this is all sort of mixed in with it here, the model was photographed in 55. So I think by the time 81 happened, he was somewhat out of favor. I could only imagine, because he used to just photograph everything for them. I don't know. And he did get to photograph it. So here's a model. And it's just interesting to see how the plaza is handled. You can't really see, there's a little bit of a square indentation there where the pool would be, or not the pool, but the sunken garden. And that keeps changing. Now, this is not a picture of the building or the model. This is a photograph from the building. And now you're back at the model, looking down at a different element. This one has a sort of swoopy stair ramp in the, sure looks like a pool, doesn't it? So this was particularly interesting to me, and I'll just tell you slowly as we go through this that you see a change there. It's a whole different configuration. What I found interesting in looking through these, now you see, to get this vantage point, another blocky building that was in there, at the last image of the model is gone. People think of his work as being very austere and with not having many people in it, but there are pretty many people here. You know, he photographed this in 81, and at that point, because this was fairly near his studio, I think he must have made 6 or 8 trips down to the building. And one of the last times, he had one image yet to do, and somehow there was nobody around to go with him. He asked me to come along, not that I was any kind of assistant, but, you know, he's under the dark cloth. Somebody can keep a foot on the equipment or watch out what's going on behind him or so on. So these were all done a day when I wasn't there. But he asked me to drive down with him. This is interesting because it's very much this point of view. He was standing over here. I mean, you'll see the picture that he took that day. And he stand around. It's completely in the dark. At that time of day, there was no sunlight on this plaza. And we're standing around and standing around. I'm thinking, well, I didn't quite get it. I didn't understand the timing. And he said, well, look, in 10 minutes, the light will come across, through those 2 buildings, come across this plaza. It'll be full of light. We'll make the picture and we'll go home. And then, so in 10 minutes, it did exactly what he told it to do. And I mean, he just understood these things. But just in 9.5 minutes before he needed to make this photograph, this guy sat down. Well, it's a little complicated here because this guy sat down right in front of the camera to eat his lunch. And so that's where you have the assistant who has to say, excuse me, could you move? And so he didn't move very far. He wasn't pleased to move, but he went around the corner. And so there it was, full of light. And immediately the light keeps coming, moving away, and the whole thing's again dark, and we leave. So this is kind of the end of this aspect of it, but I did want to show you one more photograph of him working to see if you could figure out how he did that. This is the Connecticut General Building, another SOM project. This was photographed in '55. And we actually didn't find, this was were some strips of negatives that were not in with the main part of the collection. And I don't really know how he got there. and actually, then it became important to find the image that he made from there, which of course wasn't very interesting, because I guess he felt he had responsibility to do all sides of the building or get it from this. He had to get high enough to get above those trees. But it was, for all the trouble, certainly not the best image. So I thought that was a way of describing how he worked, showing what the city looked like in those years, and just sort of get a chance to tell you how it's changed for me, how when I've looked at these photographs a lot in the course of time. But of course, every time you take another look, the images may be the same, but you're always different. I mean, you're bringing a whole different piece of history along with it. So if you can figure that one out, you'll tell me. I don't know. So I guess that's the story. That's the story.
Can I tell you your story?
Oh, the story. Okay, yes, really. We were trying to figure out how to be allowed to photograph at the UN. It's a very political situation, and I'm seeing photographs now that people are taking and they're allowing to have published. But we offered to even, go and do it without being paid, but then we'd have to have the photographs to use. That was not allowed. So when was this? 4 months ago, just now. Well, maybe it was a little longer ago than that, because the photographs of the inside of the Seagram building, where you see all the sort of concrete forms, made me think about that. So I don't know if this is a story that Werner Schmidt tells everybody, but I said, so is this a union job? Oh yes, very secure job. But he said, the security people came to us and said, we think there are gangs here in this construction crew. I said, what, gangs? That can't be. Oh no, they're gangs. We know their names and we know their gang colors. How can this be? I said, well, they're called the pipes and the vents and the ducts. And the pipes are yellow, ducts are blue. And so they had it all figured out, and they did say, no, that's gangs. But that's good security if they're keeping an eye out for that. But we in the end weren't allowed to do anything there.
When Hitchcock filmed North by Northwest, he wasn't allowed in. So that's all fake. And they came up with ways to try to across, I think they shot from across the street, the exterior scene from, I mean, they might as well have been the CIA. They shot from like a hot dog truck that was fake, that they just set up. And so they would never let in, everything is fake. But then they must have changed their mind for a while, because there was a film a few years ago called The Interpreter, I think, what they called Pigment, and they were allowed to shoot inside. So I don't know what changed. Maybe it was right before the deconstruction.
Maybe there's nobody in it. I don't know.
Yeah.
That whole project is so interesting. I think they built a sort of temporary building north of there in the garden on the north side of the building. That's like a big metal shed. But it was sort of fabulous. Part of the tour was to go inside this. It was like being really going in and going outside, because there were rooms around the sides, and because they didn't know what to do with the big tapestries and the enormous artwork, they hung it in this thing that was like a gas station. So it was just sort of a wonderful combination of both very cold and very hard materials, and with that stuff. I was just looking at Metropolis on the way down here, and those have now been installed in the delegates' lounge, or a room that's definitely finished now, but and that's been photographed. But but not by us. I mean, we thought that would be interesting to have, especially because Ezra photographed the building so many times from the hole in the ground, from the pipes and the ducts and the vents, and all the way through the final stages on many occasions. But not for us. Yeah.
This seems like, and maybe it creates a little bit of illusion, I'm not sure, that he has pretty much free reign on what he's photographing, how he's going to do it, where he's going to do it, et cetera, et cetera. But you must have some personal experience with the interaction with his clientele. Could you speak to that as to what they expected, how he planned it out, and how and I'd be very curious to hear what might be contentious between them. When he renders the photographic product, for example, how might they even be disappointed with some stuff or really like some stuff? Or
Well, I guess maybe the disappointment you didn't hear so much. But when you talk about the clients, you mean the architects who were commissioning for the most part. I mean, I thought you were meaning access to the buildings, and that, of course, was much less rigorous than it is now.
He was on commission most of the time.
Mostly working for architects and working for magazines. And the magazines now, of course, don't do any of that anymore. Well, he was always connected to the head designer or the head of the firm. I mean, he was sort of asked to do this for history, for archives, and he was considered a fairly important character. And I think he considered himself to be slightly above the hired help. You know, some people know that you're supposed to go to the service entrance. He didn't go to the service entrance. Although he was also at the same time sort of a peculiar combination, because he was also proud of being sort of a worker. He considered himself a worker, but he also always went in a white shirt and a tie. And also was expecting to if he was asked to photograph people in their offices, he'd go to the president's office and knock on the door. So it's just a curious sort of thing. I mean, as a person, and you know, several people here knew him, and I think, you know, we're all many people, so your children don't know you the way your colleagues do. He was a very exacting person. He was never really pleased with himself, and so he was always pushing to do things more so. And if a photographer would deliver contact sheets, he'd deliver prints that were this big in a bound book, or he would always go the next step. So there was never anything sort of haphazard about what he did. And the whole process would involve bringing the film back to the lab, and he actually had built a whole lab for himself because he was never pleased with what he got from anybody else, and he wasn't pleased then either, but at least it was his own fault. The color film for many years was processed at a color lab, a separate color lab, but he always had a black and white darkroom. Black and white was processed, the film was all laid out, and then it was put in sequence, so it was very careful to organize it that way. And everything was cropped, every individual image was cropped. Early on, he would then make prints, black and white prints, and present them in these bound books. For color, of course, it was difficult because the transparency was the original piece of film. And to crop that properly, in the beginning I remember he would cut them, these viewing mats. When I once tried to cut a mat, I remember making someone laugh. It would look like it was done by an animal. It was really not a good job. But, and so he'd present the color and the black and white to the client for the review. Disappointed, afraid that he didn't quite get what he wanted. The business with color was difficult because he coming out of this whole union background, he was very involved in copyrights and photographers' rights, and expected that the film was his property. You could look at it, you could reproduce it, we could make you prints, we could make you slides. But over the course of time, a lot of the color disappeared. You had to lend it to the client, you had to lend it to a magazine, you hope somebody would give it back. You know, things happen, you can't, and they really, because the color was photographed in different exposures, there was always one best one. And even when you tried to lend out the second best one, who knows? Once the best disappears, the second best looks better. I mean, you've got no comparison. And all that's so much now. Does that answer your question a little bit about his expectations? Yeah. Yeah.
The exhibition at Yossi Milo, there was a photograph that he took in the General Assembly building. I believe it was just before it opened, and there was a woman at a desk at a counter, and thinking of that and the photographs of the Seagram building, where there was just a solitary worker. It's almost as if your father appreciated a neutron bomb going off. It might have just have been a figure to just lend shape or a sense of dimension. Mm-hmm. Was that generally true? Was that something you'd like to control, or was that just a circumstance or a result of the circumstance?
I guess the answer to a question like that is yes. I think he did like to control it, but I think the people that you see in the pictures were really theirs. There's no Photoshop games here going on. Those people were there. Did he tell them to stay there? Did he tell them to go there and stay still for a moment? Probably sometimes he did. But in some circumstances, I mean, guys in a construction building, of a building in Chicago, high up on the girders, he's moving along, and he's not stopping for anything. So I think that, but it's interesting when you think back to those sort of solitary figures. I guess that says something too, And yet, as I was saying, there are plenty of photographs with lots of action and lots of people too. We came on a series of photographs that were made at the end of the war in Times Square on VEVJ Day, which somebody knows when it was. It was September 1945 or August. It's incredible photographs of just millions of people. And you don't even think of him ever having made images like that. We found them, and they're on a kind of film that even the guy who printed them, who's a big sort of film historian, couldn't quite figure out. They had no... And either it was motion picture film. I don't know. So that's another sort of thing. I mean, it's a direction he could have gone in. Moment when he had to make some decisions about architecture, which for him was pretty classy. I think he liked the work, liked being around with the people, or traveling around to factories and foundries and hydroelectric plants, and he could have done that as well. So he stuck with this. I guess it's good. Okay, thanks.